All right, it is noon, and we still have attendees kind of popping in as we go, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Everyone with my panelists ready to go?
Great.
All right. So, hi everyone. Welcome to the Midwest Manufacturing Advisor webinar. This is the third part of our series on tough topics in manufacturing. Today, we are focusing on how manufacturers can finish stronger in 2020. We'll be talking about manufacturing business strategies, both pre and post COVID-19, budgetary factors to consider in 2021, marketing and sales strategies, workplace environments, and more along the way today with our panel. My name is Steph Nissen. I'm from Atomic Revenue, and I will be the moderator of our panel today. Our panel will be answering a series of questions that address the topics I just mentioned above, and you'll be able to ask your own as well. So if you have questions along the way, please drop them either into the chat, which I'll be monitoring, or into the designated Q&A box that you'll see in your Zoom screen. You can do that at any time during the webinar. We'll try to address some questions as we go, and others we'll do at the very end. And if anything doesn't get answered, one of our panelists will follow up with you and get the answers that you need. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers and panelists and allow each of them to wave, nod, so you can see who they are. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to tell you the best way to be able to see all of our panelists and speakers. In your Zoom screen, you're going to see all of us on video. Sometimes Zoom will default to show you speaker view, which you might see me as a big head on your screen right now and lots of tiny boxes along the top of everyone else. This is called speaker view. You can change this in the top right corner of your Zoom screen by clicking on view, and in the drop down, you can also change to gallery view, which now makes us all Brady Bunch style. And you can see everyone all at the same time instead of waiting for Zoom to change who's the featured speaker based on who's talking. It's all your preference, but hopefully you find the way that makes the most sense for you today and get the most out of our webinar. So now let's talk to our panelists. First up, welcoming John Olgin from Mueller Prost. He's the Director of Manufacturing and Distribution. Hey, John.
Hello there.
We have Tara Kinney, who's the CEO at Atomic Revenue. We have Tom Swip, who is president and founder of Swip Systems.
Morning, everyone.
And Gerald Richardson, labor and employment law at Evans and Dixon.
Hi, Steph.
Hey. So we're going to jump right into the questions. So my very first question is for John. John, how has your long-term strategy changed pre and post-COVID? And what do you think will change regarding that pivot?
Well, our manufacturing clients have learned one major thing, and many have adopted a strategy that previously wasn't that well or broadly accepted, and that is to develop a strategy that is both nimble and responsive to the opportunities and the conditions that are on hand. So if it were a flexibility, I'm reminded of the first baseman for Tampa Bay that stretches out and gets on the ground and does a splits because he has trouble getting up, but to be that nimble to do that is extraordinary. So I think that the opportunity that you see there is to look at your strategy and moving it forward to try and be nimble. And I would say the majority of those companies have now focused on being there. Other areas that they've adjusted in their strategies is to look at their logistics and their foreign sourcing and their local sourcing and to determine, do they have the right mix and do they have the right sources? Reshoring, which has been occurring, has just exploded during this process because people recognize, hey, we can't get all of our masks from China. But even so, just in manufacturing, do we really want to run the risk that our sources are only abroad in one country? Of course, worker safety has also become part of the strategy implementation and the increased emphasis on that matter. Product development has also taken a change. We do a lot of research and experimentation work, and we've seen companies now begin to focus on new products, new product categories, because they recognize that some of their products may not return to the pre-COVID levels, even post-COVID. So of course, then the other one is facilities with people working from home. And we were just talking about that earlier. More and more companies are now looking at that as a human resources strategy. So there's just some of them that might be out there that people are looking at changing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John, for that list. That was really comprehensive. Tom, what would you add to that, or what other things do you see
Yeah,
for the post and pre-COVID strategies?
yeah, thanks, Steph, and thanks for everyone for being here this morning. And just to echo a little bit more of what John said, what we're seeing is that, if we look at strategy and tactics, the strategy is hard to calculate long-term right now. But if we are more tactical about our strategy, which may sound a little bit odd, but like John said, being a little bit more nimble and looking at more tactical in the short term, the interim, about things that you would like to do, things like ramping up sales. I had a client that is looking like they're going to have a depression in our essentially a depression in end of 22. And what they're looking at is building a huge backlog. So, they're doing everything that they can to build up a big backlog so that when that time comes, they can work through it. Internally, we've automated every system that we can possibly think of. So anything, from collecting the mail to putting out estimates, we've tried to think of, okay, what is the backup of this in case something like this were to happen again in the future? Not an extension of this virus, but maybe another virus in the future. And then we've essentially never stopped marketing. So that's one of the things that we've seen a lot of people do. That's kind of a death sentence. If we're going to cut on sales and cut on marketing, we're actually doing, and we're recommending to all the manufacturers that they do the opposite, that they go out and they find new markets, essentially markets that they may not have been in, with possibly larger customers that will actually survive through the current times as well as any future pandemic along these lines.
Absolutely. Tara, what would you add to that?
Yeah, agility, automation, absolutely on my list for how long-term strategies are changing, but primarily data and diversification. Those are the two areas: diversification of suppliers, diversification of market, diversification of products. All of that gives you the ability to be flexible and pivot when things change. So we all knew we were supposed to be diversified before, but now all of a sudden that is an elevated effort and strategy, and definitely stratactical. We want there are real things that have to be done right now. And if we had good data, we'd know what those things were. And historically, we've kind of been a little lax in the data in parts of our organizations, that when they're disrupted, we don't know what stratactical moves to make. What do we need to do right now? And so it's not only about agility, but the ability to be fast with the change. Because if you don't have the data, you are ultimately going to be slower to make the change than your competitors who do have good data. So diversification and data.
Absolutely. And that really leads into my second questions about what lessons has your coronavirus pandemic workplace taught you that you will carry now into a post-pandemic workplace? So it sounds like data is a big one for you.
Oh, absolutely. I think nothing like a pandemic has reminded us that every single day, every single person in our company is making decisions that impact everything else. And most of the time, we have not provided data to the people in our organization to make those decisions. And now that people are working in diverse locations, different times, they're more spread out, giving people the information to make good decisions every day, all day is really important. But the other thing is having good data at the management layer so we know what everyone's doing and we know how to make changes and how to modify what's happening. So absolutely, data is the top of my list for a number of questions on today's.
Absolutely. Jerry, what about you? What lessons has your, pandemic workplace taught you that you're going to carry into a post-pandemic workplace?
Well, for most employers and manufacturers especially, they need their workers, and their workers need to feel safe, both to return to work and to continue working. So a heightened awareness of safety, and safety in a much broader sense, perhaps. Many employers looked at safety in terms of, is there an OSHA regulation I must follow? And that's not good enough. What you really have to do is look at your employees, and now because of COVID-19, there's a number of uh, things that have become somewhat ordinary, but are very important in the CDC guidance. So things like social distancing in the workplace, which requires some reworking of the workplace. Uh, many employers have looked at their ventilating equipment and improved their ventilating equipment. Certainly, daily health checks are something that were never done before this pandemic and have become rather routine. And we see them going through phases. So where they may have been done at the workplace, they're frequently now done before employees even go to work. And there may even be an app, and they just answer questions on an app. So there's a progression that is going on, and it's something that's important to stay abreast with. And I think one of the biggest changes, and it even affects manufacturers, is the concept of remote working. Certainly, administrative staffs and sales teams are likely candidates for remote working, but there are some manufacturers, say with CNC machines, where even those machine operators can work remotely. And that's an entirely different workplace than the one before the pandemic. And it's one that works well for some employees and not so well for other employees. And employers have to be sensitive to that and adjust how they deal with their workers because of these big changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, I heard Jerry talk about, the apps piece, and because of your experience and obviously technology and all things apps related, I'm curious about your thoughts on that piece.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. So it's interesting because we have an alarm that goes off about every morning around 7 o'clock on our house. And it's a reminder to have our girls check their temperatures and submit their temperatures to their school inside of their app. So they're in their 10th week of in-person classes, knock on wood, no problems or anything of the sort yet. But every morning they check their temperature and they check in that way. And we've seen a lot of manufacturers really lean on app technology to get their workforce more connected, or more connected to inventory, more connected to vendors, anything along those lines. But we've definitely learned a couple lessons around automating everything. So back to what I said earlier, everything that you couldn't do in the office last time, take a look at it and how you could switch it around and how you could automate it. And then remote and hybrid policies is another big one for us. So I've read a ton of articles on this. I've talked to a lot of different business owners. There are a lot of different opinions on this. But what we learned over the whole thing is remote work is mostly about trust. It's easy to see people in the office. They're doing their work and everything along those lines. And you trust that they're doing their work at that point. When they're remote, you can't. So we've learned to trust our people more. We've gone with a hybrid remote policy where we're in the office part of the time and out of the office the other part of the time. So it's kind of goes back to that old saying of delegate but follow up. Just go back to make sure that you're passing off in detail what you need, and then just follow up to make sure everything's done. And most people will do what they need to do. Now that doesn't apply to everybody, and it can't apply to everybody, but that's one of the lessons that we've learned. And the last one is just never waste a good crisis. So just like getting ready for a party, you get your house completely ready and all those things that you wanted to get done, are finally done before the party because you had a deadline. That's kind of what this was like, get everything ready that you need to get ready for the quote unquote party, although this is not a party, and, just never waste that good crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah. Jerry, you had a thought.
Tom has an emphasis on trust, but I know I've run into clients that's trust but verify, and there's monitoring going on of computer use remotely as well that goes on. I think another thing that comes into play is flexibility with dealing with employees. You're certainly going to see a number of employees who are exhausting their 12 weeks of leave for childcare, and employers, to the extent that they can, ought to try to find ways to work with their employees when that happens, be it through unpaid leave, changes in schedules, so that maybe between the two parents, if they have different work days, they can manage their kids and those kinds of things. And that will pay off with greater loyalty and more productivity from those employees in the long run.
Absolutely. Joseph, thank you for your question in the chat. We are going to talk a little bit more about workplace safety guidelines and cleaning a little bit later. So I'm going to save your question for that time in our panel today, but I do see it. Thank you for that. And if anyone else has questions, please do continue to drop them into the chat or into the Q&A section. So Tom, now I'm curious, we've been very reactionary, right, to everything that we've been thrust upon with COVID-19. So how do manufacturers pivot from their strategy from survival mode back into growth mode?
And you hear a lot about that now, Steph, especially, with 2021 strategy and everything coming, and we're in the last quarter of 2021 and 2020. You may have heard from an earlier webinar that we had on Tough Topics. The virus is actually fear. So, COVID is obviously out there. It's a very real thing. There's still people that are afraid to leave their homes, which is okay. But fear is kind of leading a lot of our decisions right now. And if you lead a decision, or if you answer a decision based off of fear versus based off of what you need or what you want to accomplish, you come out with a very different result. So what we've tried to do is just generally get over that fear. And that's what we're recommending. The people that may be not as fearful as others, we believe that we should lead, into the next economy, so to speak. We need to get ourselves back to some sort of normalcy as much as we can. We need to get back to strategic thinking. We need to get back to a growth mindset. A growth mindset thrives on challenges, and there's never been a challenge like this before. So if we want to really face this thing on as a challenge, we need to get back to problem solving mode. And some of the things that we do best as business owners and high level executives, we need to make sure that we're getting back to problem solving mode and thinking about this as a big problem and looking at it as how do we overcome it. And I think if we go back into that portion of our brain where we're used to solving problems and we get out of the fear portion of our brain, I think we're going to make a whole lot better headway over the next several months.
Absolutely. Tara, what do you think about that? Shifting from survival mode to growth mode?
Absolutely. It's tough. As business leaders, we tend to be a little bit higher risk takers than maybe some of the other people that work in our organization. And if you have multiple people leading your company, you're going to find that some of them are more risk tolerant than others. So trying to help everyone be comfortable with some of the risks that have to be taken right now when that might not be their natural state brings itself back to several of the topics that we're talking about now, right? Is information. Can we give everybody information so that they can feel more confident about some of the risks in the problem solving that we have to take? We don't know the answers of the future. We've never known them before, but we were okay because it was kind of normal, right? So we do that every year. So now with all the unknowns for next year, we still see a lot of people frozen. And the entire leadership team of organizations can freeze when there's a couple of key players that aren't able to be confident with a decision to move forward. So a lot of the things we're talking about, again, come into play here of data. What information do we need in order to make the decision? And how are we going to measure whether or not something new that we're going to do is working, to give you the confidence that if it's not working, we can cut it quickly. But we need to make some moves, right? So what are we going to measure to know whether or not it's working? And we're going to continue doing that. And then the other piece is increased communication, because regardless of whether or not we as business leaders of our manufacturing facilities or our teams are comfortable moving forward and we have a great strategy and we're going to move, we're going to go ahead, it's not going ahead as normal. So instead of having water cooler chats at all these times where we bump into each other at the office and get comfortable that we're all on the same bus or rowing in the same direction, now we have to make that a very conscious effort, very deliberate communication, engage our employees, communicate top to bottom of organizations. Making decisions at leadership and dragging everybody else along is not going to work when half the company is still in this fear-based mentality and not sure how to proceed. So we're going to have to invest a lot in communications going forward in order to pivot or move our strategies.
Absolutely. And so I hear what you're saying about, the communication when it comes internally. So now let's switch gears and talk about communication when it comes to prospects and clients. So that marketing and sales plans that you have, how can manufacturers change their marketing and sales plans to reach customers in this current environment, new normal, whatever buzzword strikes you better than another, right? How do they make changes? when we don't have the information?
Yeah, so this one's great because it goes back to trust. We're talking about, whether or not your clients, your prospects, your market trust you. And when they can't see you, do you even exist? Right? So who are you trying to talk to? Are you still present in their world now that everything has changed? They are not in the places they used to be. They are not meeting you in the same way that they used to. Their schedule is different than it used to be. So each one of our businesses is very different in the way that we have historically approached marketing and sales, but really looking at who are those people that we need to engage with? Where are they? What are they doing now? And how do we continue to maintain and establish trust in the way that we're working with them? So again, we come to that very scary factor of fear of change, right? And so you've got your sales organization and your marketing organization who have always done it one way. And we tend to have a lot of other people in our organization who don't necessarily understand what's going on in marketing and sales. It's some kind of magic sauce that shows up in the financials later. So we really need to work on training and developing not only tools and techniques for our marketing and sales organizations to change to the ways our markets want to buy, but training.
Absolutely.
So people say, I'm going to get a new tool and it's the way that everyone engages these days, but we're going to skip the 12 weeks of training. You're just going to figure it out. Well, that's putting an awful lot of burden onto people. You're not only asking them to handle the change, but then figure out how to do it all on their own. So don't skimp on the training.
Yeah, and I see Tom nodding along like, oh God, yes. So what about you, Tom? What about what you're seeing with manufacturers in your own organization with changing marketing and sales plans?
Yeah, I remember hearing back in March that this might last until June. And I remember going, June, there's no way, there's no way it's going to last until June. Well, Thanksgiving's next month. So it's obvious that we're going to be this way for a while. So what I've tried to do and what I've recommended is just to learn how to do the same things that you used to do, but just do them virtually. Just like right now, we're learning virtually. We obviously can't network like we used to, but there's ways of doing network and everything that we do virtually. So the most importantly, think along the lines of getting your virtual presence right. So, your camera angle, your lighting, having conversation starters, like with Tara, the two posters in the back of her background there, those are great conversation starters, or asking John about the cool chair in the background of his background, something along those lines. But using that virtual environment to actually conduct a normal conversation. One of our guys was lamenting last night that we've been working with the gentleman for about 9 months, all virtual. We met him last night and he doesn't seem like this guy, you know what I mean? He's a little bit thinner. He's a little bit more techie looking, there is going to be that challenge and you can't read the body language and everything, but if you can learn to do things virtual, then you'll in a much better place to do this. Things like waving when you get in to encourage people to turn their cameras on and things along those lines. But just think about the things that you used to do that made you a success and turn them into a virtual aspect of that. And I think then you'll be able to use the tools and the things that in a new manner and be very successful.
Absolutely. And that really lends well to this next question. We had a lot of our manufacturers, right? We're moving into remote work and we now are in this digital world, and the average salesperson, regardless of industry, the average salesperson is around age 42 and quite frankly, not as tech savvy, right? We didn't grow up with iPhones in our hands. And we're not familiar with doing a lot of business on video conferences. It's very much relationship face to face, right? They're not used to being on camera all the time. How do we empower our sales teams if we're going to change our sales and marketing strategies, right? How do we empower them to get what they need to succeed in today's market? Tara, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are a number of people who have been training and coaching and developing people to deliver conversations on video and in virtual ways. You think of Edward Jones has invested a ton in this space, right? And so there's a number of people where I have to engage with you because you are in a different geography, which is more and more acceptable now. So for a lot of a lot of people, it's about what's in it, you know, for me that can help me make this change. I'm not incentivized to change. And I'm not embracing the change just because I have to, because of this terrible pandemic that's, you know, making my life difficult all over the place, right? So if we think about those people that we're asking to change and what resources do they need, it could be a very individualized transition for each person. But some of the people who have been selling in person and need to sell virtually need some coaching on how do I present better on camera. I've been practicing talking with my hands where you can see them because I'm a hands talker. But, you know, there's things like that, that just some practice makes it more comfortable. And they get used to seeing themselves over time on camera. But also being able to deliver the same message when people can't see you. How am I going to combine phone, email, video, all these different techniques to reach you when we're able to connect with each other? So that's where automation comes in. And if you can automate those tasks so that it makes it easier for them. Oh, I'm supposed to call now. Oh, you know, this time I'm going to set up a video chat. It'll really help some of the team members adopt new technologies because that automated workflow is going to tell them which technology to use when.
Right. Absolutely. And we've been talking a lot about strategy, and we've been talking a lot about marketing and sales. And I want us to be able to talk about all the different things that affect manufacturers, right? And all those tough topics. So we're going to move forward into talking about employees and workplace safety guidelines. You know, we're going to address Joseph's question from the chat. We're going to talk about upgrading our talent and our people a little bit more. So Jerry, this question is for you. So how well have employers really coped with COVID-19 workplace safety guidelines, those staggered work shift and working from home options? There's so many different things, cleaning and sanitizing, you know, and what else should they be doing for their employees right now?
Well, I think on the whole, they've worked fairly well. And I think what bears that out is there hasn't been, there are some lawsuits that are out there. OSHA has started issuing some citations, but they're relatively low in number. And for the most part, if you're going to operate, you're finding a way to do it in a way so that the employees feel safe. And that's the most important thing. And so things like the social distancing, they don't have a dramatic cost for most. They can have some cost for some. Erecting barriers more if you're investing in better ventilation, certainly that can have greater cost, but a lot of things face coverings. They're really not that expensive, and it's just a matter of making the change and kind of changing the culture to one that's more proactive about safety in the environment where you know the transmission occurs mostly through droplets spreading through the air.
Absolutely. So this kind of really leads well into Joseph's question too, which I want to combine with this one, and I want to get Tom's take as well. Joseph asked, has your organization or your client organizations implemented rigorous cleaning and sanitation protocols and or processes? And if they did, will these continue moving beyond the pandemic? And in other words, will you or your clients continue everything as the standard for cleaning? Tom, what about you guys?
Yeah, so we've seen both ends of it here. Luckily, we've been able to make sanitizers available, make hand sanitizers available, cleaning sanitizers for, wiping down an office or something like that. Make hand sanitizers available, masks available. Everybody was pretty much social distance here because of their own offices, but we've spread out in the conference room. We've hold meetings at other locations in the building as a result of, getting too many people in one spot. So we've seen that side of it where it's been pretty simple, but I also know clients that are, they're implementing some of the sprayers that actually they come through and they spray, like you may have seen on some of the airplane commercials, where they're actually spraying the planes down as a whole, as well as implementing lighting systems, that actually, I don't know the science behind it, but it actually kills the virus with light. So we've seen both extremes of it. More so the previous one though, where with more regular cleaning. Definitely not the word that Joseph used. It was rigorous.
Rigorous, yes.
But more standard cleaning schedules, having the cleaning company come in twice a week, or maybe there's somebody on staff that takes care of it now, things along those lines. But we have seen the opposite end of it as well.
I'm curious, what about you, John Mueller-Prost, and your manufacturing clients? How's the rigorous cleaning and sanitation protocols? Are you going to keep doing it?
Oh, I think they'll keep doing it. And I think the people's fear will last quite some time for a future pandemic, whether or not there's one as this nature is. I find it interesting. We've even seen the cleaning be occurring in the shop floor with respect to controls that maybe in the past were never cleaned, that are now deep cleaned on a regular basis. That anytime there's a change in operators, so I think you're going to continue to see that occur. And I think, and speaking to our manufacturing clients, they're all wanting to learn new ways that they can be more effective at this. I come from a background of manufacturing operations in the food business, FDA, subject to FDA guidelines, and we're Freudian about it in those days, and now I see that same element of concern being across the board by many manufacturers, not just in the office but in the plant, and not just breathing air too, but touches and that type of thing. So I think you're going to continue to see that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. Jerry, question for you. When the FDA does approve a COVID-19 vaccine, to what extent should employers require their workers to be vaccinated as a condition of employment?
Well, given all the politicization of this issue, I think employers need to be a bit cautious. And let's look at it from two perspectives. One is, what does the law allow an employer to do? And certainly the law allows an employer to make it a condition of employment for employees to be vaccinated in order to be in the workplace. That can be done. There would have to be some exceptions if someone has a disability and for the reason of the disability cannot take the vaccine. There can be accommodations made at that point. Also, religious beliefs can figure into whether an employer has a duty to accommodate those beliefs if there's some religious belief that is incompatible with vaccines. But I think wise employers will go about this slowly, and they'll probably do things more on a voluntary basis. They will bring in a provider of the vaccine to the workplace and make it available at no cost to their workers. They'll highly recommend it. But there's going to be some suspicions that perhaps the vaccines, at least initially, have been rushed through a process because of promises made during an election campaign to have vaccines available before the election. Whoops, that may not happen. But in any case, I think there is enough, shall we say, out there in the ether that employers ought to tread lightly and encourage. They may have to make some adjustments to workers who don't get vaccinated because they do have a duty to keep their workers safe. And so there may be some isolating of particular workers who aren't vaccinated from those that are, and other things that an employer ought to do given those circumstances. But I think initially, at least, employers should take kind of a soft approach to it. Ultimately, that may change over time, and there's more acceptance to the vaccine that it may be the wisest thing to do in the long run to require a vaccine and vaccination for everyone.
Absolutely. Tara, do you have a thought around that?
I'm just going to come back to communications here. No matter how your company wants to decide to do it, these are not normal things for your HR department to communicate with your employees about. So there's really an internal public relations element to the words that are chosen and how those people are trained to have these conversations, because it doesn't matter how much you force it or make it optional. There are people that are going to light up and they're going to go straight to that HR department, and your HR people are not going to be necessarily prepared for this conversation. So it's time to bring some of that PR that you use externally, internally with your employees on this particular topic. The other thing is that there's a lot of speculation that masks will actually become one of the fashion trends ongoing in the US, the way that a lot of other countries do wear masks. And so there are other things that companies can really broadly adopt and make fun at their workplaces in order to keep some of the protections high so that people don't start dropping their guard as we head into 2021. Again, internal PR all the way.
Absolutely. So there are some, there's good and bad that comes out of the world that we live in right now. So I'm curious, John, how can manufacturers take advantage of the current labor climate to upgrade their talent?
Well, many companies are looking to, as they've began to embrace remote workers, companies should be looking at, can we attract some talent that might be of a more permanent nature remote and allows us to attract people from a broader geographic territory and maybe even a broader skill set than what we've previously been able to do when we've thought, at least we had the belief that the people had to be on site. And more companies are doing that. And then you look at companies ought to be looking and saying, are there industries that run parallel to our service needs or our employment needs that might be out there being suffered, or even our competitors that might be suffering more than we are? And are there is there available workforce out there that might allow us to attract somebody from that industry? For instance, we have a client that does not serve the automotive business. It's in the machining operations, but does not serve automotive. So they've gone after the automotive persons who might be slow or not working because of the slowdown in the automotive area or the aerospace area or other things like that, saying we need to attract these people. It's not being vultures, but it is being proactive in trying to determine that. The other aspect of that is as people become more akin to remote working is developing their skills and looking for their creativity about what else can we do. Like Jerry said, people are now looking at running equipment from remote operations using robotics, using pre-planned programs, the interface. There's nothing to say that a screenshot running a machine you have to be sitting there in the plant.
Absolutely. Tom, what do you think about those and taking advantage of the current labor climate?
Yeah, thank you, Steph. So, obviously with the employment rate on the rise, there are a lot of people out there that are looking for work. There's a lot of A players out there that have gotten laid off from some incredible roles. So they are out there. It's a matter of finding them. But do beware of the people that were probably laid off first, the people that needed to go anyway. And this was just maybe used as an excuse to get them out the door. There are two books that one that I was just recommended a few days ago called Top Grading, all one word, TOP Grading. By Bradford Smart. And then there is another book called Who by Jeff Smart. And yes, they do both have the same last name. I believe it's a father and son couple. So Top Grading and Who, they are both really good books on zeroing in on interview techniques, what you're looking for, how to go about finding the right A players, the real A players, what I call the top 5%ers. And it may even be 4, 3, 2, 1 top percenters, maybe it's the top 4%ers, but there's a lot of good talent out there. It's really a matter of figuring out if they are the A players and then bringing them onto your team.
Absolutely. So, with these, taking advantage of new labor that could be remote, that could be outsourced, to contract employment, it could be full-time employment. What are the top things that manufacturers overall are outsourcing or taking back in-house that they previously outsourced? Jerry, what are you seeing?
Well, I do see a number of employers and manufacturers among them, in order to keep up with everything that is going on with COVID-19, because you have CDC guidance, you have OSHA guidance, you have Equal Employment Opportunity Commission guidance, and the guidance itself is evolving over time. So if you look at what was in place in April of this year, and now you look at what's in place, they're different and sometimes markedly different. For example, last week, the CDC changed the definition of contact with a person that has coronavirus. So that instead of looking at a period of contact of 15 consecutive minutes, it's 15 minutes over a 24-hour period. You go, well, why is that important? Because that determines whether you have to quarantine people. If someone has that kind of contact and they're not showing any symptoms, you quarantine them. And if they have no symptoms for 10 days, you can bring them back. So, these things are hard to keep up with. And for that reason, it's a long-winded response to say they do tend to be looking for experts who spend their days keeping up with the changes in these kinds of guidances and regulations that occur. So I have seen, for example, people like me are in demand for that kind of advice.
Absolutely. And I want to get John's take on this too. And then we're going to go through as many more questions as we can in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And then please, our attendees, if you have questions about what we're talking about or other things you like just popped in your head and you want to brain trust it with this group, please drop it in the chat so we can answer those questions for you. So John, what about you? Outsourcing, taking in-house, what are manufacturers doing?
Well, many companies are looking to not necessarily totally outsource functions, but perhaps supplement, as Jerry, I think, was referring to, that hey, I'm going to supplement my HR administration because they are just overwhelmed right now with the issues that they're addressing. So that's a common one. Another one is the IT area for the same reason. They've not had 95% of their workforce working remotely, and now they're saying, I need to have this outsourced. I do think it's accelerating the people looking at utilization of the cloud and IT outside support services on an accelerated method that may have taken the 5 years of migration that may have occurred over the next 5 years, I should say, and that being occurring. Another one area is logistics and supply chain optimization opportunities, where companies are looking and saying, we've got to make a lot of changes, as we referred to earlier in the strategy. We have to make a lot of changes here, so we're going to need some help getting that done. So they're looking at that. And then the other one that goes along with that is CFO services, which not to be self-serving, but CFO services are frequently being outsourced in an increased fashion because we have one company that all they're doing is looking at what's going to happen, the what ifs, and building multiple scenarios. And candidly, their current accounting and finance persons do not have the time. And so they're looking at project-based type outsourcing on some of those things. So I think those are some of the items that are being out there. And I think outsourcing and the gig economy will only continue to grow.
Absolutely. Tara, do you have a thought around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that everyone is getting wiser to getting specialized expertise for temporary or short-term projects to deliver level 10 talent versus hiring an employee who might be a generalist across 10 different skill sets. With the gig economy, we're seeing manufacturers, which have been a little more hesitant or slower to adopt some of these changes versus tech companies and others that have been tapping into the gig. So on the manufacturing companies take the risk to have that person as an employee because I want top talent and I can get a fractional expert, right? To augment my team, I can get a specialist in a specific area. And they don't have to be local anymore. So that's the other thing with the pandemic is that I can get a specialist, it doesn't matter where they are, to do the work for me. And therefore they can do it faster. And I don't have to spend our resources managing them because they already know what needs to be done, right? So those are some
Absolutely.
of the reasons why companies are outsourcing more in fractional executives, fractional managers, also just subject matter experts.
Absolutely. So when we're looking at, all these different things we talked about with strategy and what's going to, what we had to just survive through and adapt, what we're going to keep with us into the next year and always going to be a part of our lives, money and budget is going to come into play here. So what is the one thing, if you have to pick, right, of all these things we've talked about today, what's the one thing companies need to factor into their budget for 2021 that they may not have had in 2020? John, what would be your one thing?
Productivity. I'm concerned that they're working as people migrate to remote. Not that remote can't be as productive or even more productive, but the productivity initial, that curve is still being developed. So I think that would be my number one thing.
Right. What about you, Jerry? What's the one thing that may not have been in the budget before, but it's got to be in 2021?
If you're bringing people back into the workplace, I think you really seriously have to look at testing. There's been a great example at the University of Illinois with saliva testing that's been approved by the FDA. They started in July. They haven't had any flare-ups. And it's not testing alone, it's testing and contract tracing. And so you can do those things. There's even apps for contact tracing, which enable you to do at least the workplace contacts in a very efficient way. And
Fantastic.
so these are things that employers ought to have in mind.
All right, Tara, what's your one thing to the budget?
Data, and not more spreadsheets. So this is going to be a big one, because if you automate your data, you can get it into the hands of people no matter where they are, and people know the data that's specific to their role and the productivity of the people that they're managing, which means that you're going to have to look at your systems and whether or not they're capturing the data that you need to pull into a dashboard, and then whether or not your processes are capturing the data that's needed in order to produce the information that all the people at all layers of your organization need access to. So that's my big one.
Absolutely. Tom, I want to hear what yours is. What is your one thing?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. So it's automation for us. So back to what we talked about earlier, looking at all the processes that were stumbling blocks or you couldn't get done, when we all had to go remote or some of us had to go remote. So a lot of people will overlook automation. They'll just live with the spreadsheets that Tara mentioned, and they'll live with the disjointed data and everything along those lines. But if you want to be able to be fully remote and survive another one of these, should it ever come, or just increase your bottom line, improve your business, it would be automating processes, automation.
Absolutely. So do manufacturers need to make plans now to make sure that financing is adequate going forward to allow them to take advantage of all these different opportunities and all these one things? What do they need to do, John?
You always need not only your current source for financing, but the next two as well. And so that really needs to accelerate in today's lending environment or borrowing environment. Accelerate your need to establish relationships with potential new financing sources. We've seen several of our clients that are not needing to change financing sources because of poor business, but because the business has been exponentially growing, that they now need to have a new business partner from a lending source, and they've outgrown their current source, and they had never started another relationship and had a relationship for 12 years. And it's like, well, we don't need anybody. We have somebody. Well, now when your business is having 100-fold increase, not 100%, 100-fold increase, they're like, oh my gosh, Dewey, Cheatham and Howe Bank can no longer cover us. So that's where you really want to be doing. And then looking at, as I mentioned earlier, many companies are saying, okay, well, this is going to happen. How long is it going to last? And being able to do that too, which is the scenarios. Contrary to what Tara might have said, sometimes you do have to use the spreadsheets, but it is information.
Absolutely. Tara, what do you think about that? About manufacturers making plans for financing?
Right. So, just really moving from that mindset of cash preservation to cash excellence, right? Are we spending money in the right areas that we need to be spending for our business to succeed going forward? And what kind of financing do we need to line up for that? So there's been a lot of cash preservation mindset this year, but business is all about spending money in the right places to grow. So we need to unlock the ability to spend money where you need it. And I think comes back to the internal operations, and then you can know how to utilize those financing relationships for a cash excellence kind of mentality versus that fear-based preservation mentality we've kind of been living this year, but are growing out of.
Absolutely. And I want to just, Joseph dropped another question in the chat. Thank you, Joseph. He said, we're having significant difficulty attracting and retaining temp labor to perform the COVID-19 cleaning in the plant. We've had similar issues with contract cleaning services as well. They don't seem to be able to attract and retain help for cleaning. What are the panel's thoughts on that? Who would like to answer that one? Don't everybody volunteer at once. I'll pick on you.
Well, one of the groups that I would use is your state labor department, because everybody who is currently on unemployment has to be engaged with the state labor department at some way, shape, or form. And I've had a lot of success for positions before, rather than treating it like regular labor recruiting and trying to get people who are proactively looking to go straight to the labor department and say, hey, this is what I need. And they have record of every single person who's on unemployment and filing for unemployment, and they feed them jobs. And people can't turn down those jobs the way that they can other jobs, because they'll lose their unemployment. So I would utilize your state labor department to try to get some candidates for those jobs, because there's a little bit more influence for them to stay with you and take those opportunities.
Jerry, you have a thought? Yes.
Yeah, I think you need to be careful. You can't just hire anybody to do these jobs. And if you're going to directly employ people, you're going to have to train them, which means you're going to have to know what the pertinent regulations are and what the correct kinds of cleaners are and what the obligations are for disclosing what's in those cleaners under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And so it's not just getting labor in place. There's a lot more to it. And it may not be a full-time position, because depending on what you're doing and what your workplace is, you may not need to be cleaning even every day. Now that can vary quite a bit. If you're in a plant where there's a lot of, it's impossible to socially distance, okay, there's going to be a lot more cleaning there than if you do have social distancing, for example. So it's probably good to look for contractors that have the experience that are necessary to do it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Jerry. I want to invite all of our panelists. Please drop your email addresses into the chat so that if anybody has any more specific questions, they can follow up with you. We have about 8 minutes left. I do have a couple more questions that have come in that I want to make sure we address, but I want to give people an opportunity to reach out to each of you individually if they heard something that they want to have, like, I need to pick Tara's brain more about this piece. If you want to be able to do that, Tara, her email address, I'm going to drop that here for all panelists and attendees so they can see that piece. And I see Tom's dropped his in there. Thank you for that. We got another question from Richard, who said, how does John see the pandemic affecting M&A activity with manufacturers in 2021?
I would say, based upon the level of activity, which basically dried up for about 6 weeks, we are back to not only recovering, but actually expanding as companies are pivoting and recognizing that it's time, that there's still opportunities out there to grow, either buy or sell. And so the reports that I'm reading show that the activity in the third quarter preliminary were about 80% of the prior year, and they expect that for the year we'll be back on pace with prior year activity levels. But I think you're going to continue to see that. I can tell you from our own experience right now, we're seeing as many deals as we've seen in quite some time, and it's exciting because the one thing that has changed, I would tell you, is that the sellers frequently are being asked to take a little bit more risk in the ongoing business, either through ownership or through earnouts and that type of thing that they may have pre-pandemic, just because of the unknown. But it really surprising, maybe hasn't changed the estimated values of the companies, unless it's been catastrophic or something. I haven't seen any change hands in restaurants, but
Absolutely. Well, if there are, I see one more question that came in from Joseph, but I'm wondering if we wouldn't recommend a place for him to find this answer. He asked, what would be a typical rate of pay per hour for those contract cleaning, labor, temp types of jobs, specifically for Northwest Ohio? Where could he go and get the answers to that?
So I wanted to drop a quick strategy in here for Joseph, because this ties to your prior question and to this one. And I think it's a strategy that works for this particular role. So in China, when they shut down the economy for the pandemic, they started doing labor sharing between employers. So restaurants would keep their employees on employment and lend them to another company that needed to ramp up production. So one of the strategies that we can learn from that example is think about hospitality industry in your area where they have cleaning procedures, but they have reduced capacity. Restaurants that have reduced capacity, are there partnerships that you might be able to create to share some of those employees that those companies want to keep on staff but can't utilize them full time if it's not a full-time role for you? And those people would be great resources to ask about rate as well, because they have people on staff with that responsibility of cleaning in particular. So the other places to get good rate information are some of the job boards. I just have a feeling that in the current climate, any rate information is going to be somewhat irrelevant. So your state labor department is probably going to be another good resource to say, what are people, how has this changed? Because with demand, rates have fluctuated significantly.
All right.
I want to add one quick
Yeah.
thing, and I want to remind people. I've seen a number of business writers who actually take this position that we're describing as so hard to fill, and encourage companies to revisit the importance and purpose of that position, not only for a job description, but also with the people involved, and help these people recognize their position and their function is extremely important. It's sort of like the security guard outside of a plant to try and keep the bad people out, and their job is to protect their fellow workers, and it's not just wiping things down. And I think that that frequently is an important aspect of it, which may cause somebody to revisit and reconsider what the job's worth.
Absolutely. Jerry, you have a thought? We can give you about one more minute before we got to wrap it up.
A couple things. A lot of the cleaning was never done before, so this is entirely new. The state departments of labor, they're different from the divisions of employment security. The state departments of labor are a good source of data for what's paid for particular kinds of positions. They're surveying that and they're getting that information on an ongoing basis all the time. So in terms of what the kind of prevailing wage is, State Department of Labor is what I'd recommend.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you, everybody who attended today. We appreciate you spending an hour with us, or if you are listening to the replay, watching the replay later, and you want to reach out to anybody, please let us know so we can get you contact information for, Tara, for Tom, for John, for Jerry, so you can get even more of your questions answered. Some of those questions are some of those email addresses are in the chat. You can see John's email address there, Tom's and Tara's. They've all been dropped there. If you have more questions, please follow up with us. Thank you for being part of the third series in our Tough Topics in Manufacturing. And I'm sure we'll see you all again in a couple of months when we find out what's now happened post-election and into 2021. Thank you all to our panelists for sharing all of your wisdom with us today.
Thank you, Steph, and thanks for everyone for attending.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
All right.